Why is it called Jewish philosophy and not Jewish theology? Because, for example, I find it curious that you don't touch on topics, for example, about Magelman, Noam Chomsky, Marx.
They're not Jewish philosophy. Marx didn't talk about Jewish philosophy, neither did Chomsky.
They are Jewish.
They are Jewish, but don't discuss Jewish philosophy. We need to make this distinction, which is the topic at hand. I'm pursuing a master's in Jewish philosophy at Ben-Gurion University. The definition of what Jewish philosophy is has been one of the most controversial topics for a century now. This has been the case since Zunz, Leopold Zunz, who was the first to coin the term Jewish philosophy. And that's where the whole debate begins. What is Jewish philosophy? He coined, is it the philosopher's ethnicity that defines whether his philosophy is Jewish, or is it the subject matter that defines whether his philosophy is Jewish? For example, Spinoza. Spinoza was very much estranged from Judaism, even excluded from Judaism. Does what he proposes count as Jewish philosophy? Just because he is Jewish, or in the case of Karl Marx, whose parents had adopted Christianity, not for religious reasons, but for social reasons. Karl Marx was born into that environment, despite his Jewish heritage. What he proposes doesn't have anything to do with Judaism. In fact, he often proposes very hostile things. So the question is whether ethnicity is enough. What's more, if someone who isn't Jewish proposes a philosophy based on Judaism, is it Jewish philosophy? It's a very complex topic, but what many agree on is that just because a philosopher is Jewish, it doesn't make his philosophy Jewish. So you won't see me saying Marx says this or that, because that's not Jewish philosophy, that's Marxism.
Third question, do you interpret the Torah literally or allegorically? Yes.
It depends on which parts, but almost never allegorically, literally most of the time. But in Judaism, we have something called the oral tradition. That is to say, even what is literal, we have a tradition that tells us how to understand that beyond just the literal meaning. Because the literal is a codification of what was transmitted, and that's why it was written that way. In other words, we have the part that is not allegorical because we are not like Philo of Alexandria. He interpreted the Torah in an allegorical way, but other currents of Judaism, for example, from the first century, like the Pharisees, they did not interpret in an allegorical way, but use other kinds of methods instead of allegory. Allegory deals with concepts closely linked to Greek philosophy. But that's why I don't dare to say that I interpret allegorically. There are certain very specific things, because if you interpret them, like Abarbanel, a sage from the 15th century, but generally, it's another method in Judaism. It's a method that can be called drash. That's the one I like the most. And in fact, most of my work is about that methodology. Drash is like a way of breaking down what the text says based on an oral tradition, something like that.
Thank you very much. And the fourth question is about the Haskalah, which is exactly what I was asking you about. Look, in Marx's On the Jewish Question, he specifically says that the emancipation of the Jew is the emancipation of the human being. So, look, when you talk about the emancipation of the Israeli Jew, I feel like you're leaving out the majority of the Jewish population because we're talking about exiles, many of whom don't even know they're Jewish. Let's say, what part would they have in this? What was the redemption? In this redemption that turns out to be the Messiah, they wouldn't have a part in the redemption of the Messiah. And it's something national because the Jews are in exile, they are scattered around the world. So I don't know if I'm making myself clear with this question. Do you understand me?
Perfect. Yes, I understand you perfectly. And this is, you hit the nail on the head, because that's the reason why I created this page. Because from the start, the Jewish people assumed that the redemption of Israel, just like the phrase you mentioned, the redemption of Israel implies a redemption of the world. This is actually discussed in Jewish philosophy by Emmanuel Levinas, a philosopher who practiced it. I don't know if you've read his work. Emmanuel Levinas proposes a brilliant one about universalism within particularism. And the reverse, the particularism of universalism. What is this? It's that by being a particular nation, you can advance universalism. It's a bold move he makes, bold in a good way. Something striking that Levinas does to explain the idea of how you can have a very particular national factor in order to break it down on a universal level. And in fact, Abraham's promise is like that. God says to Abraham in Genesis 12, speaking of particular nationalism, for what? And the verse continues, and the next one, because in you all the nations will be blessed. That is, he is making this particular factor into something universal for the families of the earth. And that's what all the prophets talk about, I think. Almost all the prophets talk. For example, Isaiah says that the nations will go to the mountain of Jacob. That is, he talks about an organism, but the Kuzari presents it through a very interesting analogy. In chapter 4, it's a book by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi from the 11th century.
Can you spell it, please?
Yes, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, maybe. It's a famous book called the Kuzari. The Kuzari is actually one of the most famous books of Jewish philosophy. And he presents this analogy that says Israel is to the nations as the heart is to the organs. That is, the heart pumps blood to the organs, but there are other organs. A body can't live without a brain, without a kidney. It needs all the organs, but the heart pumps. Israel is something like that. You can't live without a nation, without, say, Japan. Let's say Japan, right? Or like without other nations. You can't live without all of this. A world can't exist without its defining characteristics. But you need some point from which certain characteristics can be intellectual guides, spiritual guides that drive the world. That's kind of like the vision of Israel, more or less. And that's why there is a particularism within a universalism, okay?
I understand your point about Levinas, who talks about particularism within universalism, but then we're still within the Jewish religion. What would happen with the other religions?
I think it wouldn't be within the Jewish religion, but rather within the Jewish nation. And religions have no place here. Why? Because religions are ideologies. And in the end, one ideology has to prevail. I mean, this is something, maybe, Hegel, Friedrich Hegel, he talks. This idea of historical dialectic, that ideas are two ideas, for example, there's the thesis and the antithesis, and the ideas clash, the ideas fight each other, right? Until what point? Until a new idea comes out, the synthesis. And human history is like a pendulum, right? You have ideas that keep colliding, and that's how it goes. The false ideas fall away, and a new one emerges. And that's why Hegel says it's inevitable that one day we'll reach a truth that can no longer be overthrown because it's already been broken down so much. There have been so many theses and syntheses that we reach, theses and antitheses, that we reach this thesis, this ultimate synthesis of all, which is this truth. That's why in the final utopian Jewish eschatological vision, this is the truth. And we will get there when humanity matures and when we go through all these processes. That's why religions will not have a place per se. However, civic nations will have a place, although perhaps not as much as peoples, because a people is a more primitive form of nation. Nationalism is also an ideology that is imposed on a people. But what there will be are peoples, families of the land, like tribes. Well, maybe not tribes, but population groups, much simpler things. That they do have their own cultural expressions, anthropological and sociological expressions, which don't necessarily have to be religious. I think religion will die out in this generation or the next. Religions are going to end. We're witnessing the decline of religion. What we're seeing is the rise of spirituality. People don't want religion. Religion is passé. Even Judaism will experience a major shock because of this. Spirituality, many people want that. So I think that's where things are headed.
I definitely agree with you, and that's what Marx talks about on the Jewish question. Exactly, he talks about this universality, that religions will reach a point where human emancipation will be such that the existence of this supreme being will simply be assumed, and there will no longer be a need for religion. Simply, everyone will have a connection with this supreme being. And yes, I also agree with Hegel's idea of the end of history, which is like the final thesis where everything comes together. The immanent mind that is within the universe. Yes, interesting. Those were the questions, of course.
That's what Marx takes from Hegel.
Exactly, but I didn't want my questions to sound too leftist, but inevitably they do. I made them a bit leftist.
Do you want to know something interesting? That's wild. All of this, the theme of the development of history, is something Hegel revolutionized, like the idea that history has meaning. It's something Hegelian that Marx translates into practical terms, okay? About the class struggle and so on. But the idea is Hegelian in principle, but actually Hegel didn't invent it. Hegel took it from Tijo. And who did Theo take it from? I'm not saying this. This comes from academia. It's from a study by the Maharal of Prague.
How do you spell it?
Maharal Yehuda Lo. It's a strange letter, but it's Yehuda. Jehuda. The last name is Lo. O-W. Lo. That's how you pronounce Lo, but it's written like this, Yehuda Lo. He is the one who developed this idea, and he was a rabbi. And the crazy thing, do you want to hear? Marx is a descendant of Yehuda Lo. So things stay in the family.
Well, surely yes, because Marx had too many Jewish influences since he was a Jew, right? Well, there's the emancipation. Well, thank you very much, Jacob, and thank you for sharing your knowledge.